MS Now's legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher just got out of the courthouse. Also with me, former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman, also a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President Clinton and host of the Talking Feds podcast. In studio with me, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin and veteran financial journalist Ron Insana. Ron also publishes the Message of the Markets on Substack. Fallon, I can't even imagine what it was like to be in the courtroom. It wasn't just Jerome Powell who was there. Former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke was there as well, which surely underscores the stakes here. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, Chris, this argument today felt different than any of the other cases that I've been in this term. This is a Supreme Court that appears highly likely to side with Lisa Cook in this case. They expressed deep skepticism that the president has the authority to fire here and that the for cause, which is what the statute requires, was met. They repeatedly went through the process of this firing, that she was fired by Truth Social, which got a number of laughs in the courtroom, and that she was not entitled to any sort of a hearing. There's also documentation that came through the lower courts that showed that this alleged mortgage fraud was probably not even actually a reality, that there's paperwork that indicates that she insinuated that this was a vacation home. But the preliminary nature of this entire case was really on display during these arguments. Remember that this is a case that came to the Supreme Court through the emergency docket based off of a preliminary injunction. There is no final judgment that the Supreme Court justices are even ruling on here. The justices expressed frustration on a number of occasions about why this needed to be rushed so quickly, that they don't even have the facts of the case. At one point, Justice Alito asked whether those mortgage papers were even introduced as evidence in the case in the lower courts, that there is no factual basis here that they can even dissect. But Justice Brett Kavanaugh had a very sharp line of questioning for Sauer, the Solicitor General, saying that this case could open a can of worms that could create a dangerous precedent moving forward. He reminded them that what goes around comes around, and that when it does come around, it comes around even stronger. And so if they were to change this precedent here and start treating the Fed differently and give the president this power to fire the Fed, a Fed governor at will like this, then that could create a dangerous precedent for presidents moving forward. Chris?
Thank you so much for that, Lisa. I know you listened to the arguments as well. What stood out to you?
I think what stood out to me was how breathtaking John Sauer, who is the Solicitor General's conception of presidential power, is. So let's first start with the proposition that the administration is not challenging the constitutionality of the statute that governs Fed removal here. Everybody agrees that the standard is for cause. But essentially what John Sauer said was that's unreviewable by even the Supreme Court. They don't get to determine what cause means. And when the president decides that cause has been established, they don't get to second guess that at all, which prompted a bunch of incredulous responses from the justices. Like, what are we even doing here if we don't have the right to forge a remedy or even review the president's actions? You're basically telling me that the standard that exists, that he can only do this for cause, not for policy disagreements, is essentially illusory. It's ephemeral. If we can't review it, then he can really do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And Sauer didn't have an effective answer for that, Chris.
So, Harry, multiple justices did press Sauer on the question of why it's okay that Cook be removed from her position without being given a chance to even dispute the allegations against her. Here's what Justice Alito had to say about that.
Is there any reason why this whole matter had to be handled by everybody, by the executive branch, by the district court, by the D.C. Circuit in such a hurried manner? You began by laying out what you claim to be the factual basis for the for-cause removal, but no court has ever explored those facts. Are the mortgage applications even in the record in this case?
I know that the text of the social media post that screenshots to the mortgage applications is in the record, but I don't recall if the paperwork itself is in the record.
Screenshots of a social media post. Harry, your assessment.
Yeah, so the unhurried or the hurried manner that Alito is talking about means this is an emergency application where the court, where the administration is screaming, we're having irreparable injury. That and the point that Lisa made that they're not trying to say that the for-cause provision is unconstitutional. Those are the critical sort of bedrock procedural facts. What comes out of that then in a messy and underdeveloped case that the justices were in fact frustrated over is how they will send it back. I think it's true that Cook is likely to win, but they were casting about for how, with the two candidates being first, some definition of for cause that says it wasn't met here, or second, some procedural infirmity that says send it back to the D.C. Circuit to try to patch up that infirmity, with the cost being that the court has to decide the issue on the substance later. Final big point is what you had about Kavanaugh at the top. He was tiptoeing to the sort of point that is hovering here, but no one wants to say politely, which is when Trump proffered this supposed mortgage application before Cook was even on the Fed. What was really happening was a policy difference. It was a pretext, and the way they could decide it might green light that. So it's a big fact that everyone understands, even though the court in its tradition won't call out the president for that obvious pretext.
I have to say, Lisa, when we were talking earlier this morning, one of the things you said is this is one of the more straightforward ones. These are all things that you don't have to have a legal degree to understand, like where's the mortgage applications, where's the basis for this. But I want to play some of what we heard from Cook's attorney, Paul Clement, because he was asked what he thinks the president should have done to deal with Lisa Cook.
The president has to make the decision, right? Or delegate it to somebody who he wishes to make that decision, who's reportable to him.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
At will.
At will. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. I mean, and the president can be the final decision maker, but if he's going to be the final decision maker, and there's a due process right, and I mean that statutory or constitutional, then he needs to be a little bit careful and say these are the allegations. He can't start by prejudging the issue by saying resign.
What else can you tell us about how Clement made his case?
Very deftly, because one of the things Clement did was pivot when the justices put an obstacle in his way. So one of the things he said was maybe the definition of, and I'm putting words into his mouth, maybe the definition of cause isn't what we have said in our legal briefs. And what they've said is it has to be at least inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance while in office. But if it's something different than that, for example, Justice Alito raised the example of somebody who's committed sexual misconduct before office. If it's more than that, then the president has another remedy. You can always ask Congress to impeach a member of the Fed Reserve Board of Governors. So Paul Clement, extraordinarily deft, a masterclass in oral argument today. But Chris, one of the other things that I thought was really interesting was him just basically saying, let's see this for what it is. Lisa Cook was appointed to a 14-year term on the Fed Reserve Board of Governors. Even if you disagree that she had a property interest in her job akin to tenure, you have to do something more than make a Truth Social post to remove somebody for cause. That's common sense. And that goes back to the conversation you and I had this morning. This is not an intricate statute that we're unraveling at Supreme Court argument. This is something that makes sense to ordinary people. It can't just be, I am removing you for cause because I hate you, right? That's not what's going on here.
Oh, if only in some cases that were true. But fortunately, it's not. Look, we said at the beginning, Ron, that yes, and this is what we've been talking about, the limits or lack thereof of presidential power. But it's also about the economy. And tell us why people should care about this.
Well, for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which is the Federal Reserve, as we all know, sets interest rates, which determine the cost of money. And that extends from everything from your mortgage to other costs that you're going to bear buying a car over time, how the economy functions. What it also deals with and points to is whether or not the president then also has the authority, if he were to lose this case, to remove the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, whom he has criticized publicly for not lowering interest rates to his desired level. If you get to a point, and it doesn't appear that it's going this way, but had the Supreme Court judges in the future decided that the president has this power to remove Lisa Cook and then Jay Powell, he could pack the Fed with people who would do his bidding based on political considerations as opposed to economic considerations. And you get historically, when you look at other central banks that have been politicized, bad economic outcomes, whether it's inflation that's in excess of what it should be, whether a currency collapses, whether you have an adverse economic outcome. Even Brett Kavanaugh admitted that this is what's at stake. Are you threatening the independence of the Federal Reserve by doing this? And as a consequence, will this lead to outcomes that are unfavorable for the population at large, if you're going to read into what he had to say? And that is the real risk. If you have a Fed that's not independent, we've seen this time and time again, the economic outcomes are truly, in some cases, devastating, depending on where you look.